Cindy. Good girl. Welcome back to the studio again. It's so nice just to spend a little bit of time sitting outside, looking at anything and everything and nothing in particular, not really looking for anything, just allowing my eyes to wander, letting my mind wander. And I think it's probably one of those things where if you do let your mind wander, it can just allow the space for the creative vibe to enter. It's often when the most creative things happen, when you're not expecting anything to. Here are some pieces of artwork that I've really enjoyed looking at recently. The first two by Nick Walthow. You can find more of her work on Facebook or on her own website if you just Google her name. The rest are by members of my online learning community. So delightful to be sent all this lovely jolly artwork. Anne told me that she'd used the eraser on the end of a pencil to make the spots on her piece of gouache resist. These are all gouache resist technique artworks with added coloured inks. Create some beautiful layered effects here. Getting quite excited now. Right, lots of things on the drawing desk today, including a test piece. Always a good idea to test what you're going to do, isn't it? And I'll take you through what I'm going to use. I have a few things which I can print shapes with. I've got two inner tubes from dog poo bags, a cardboard one and a plastic one, which I've been using to make nice little neat circles with. And then this, which is quite a solid packing tube from something, probably cling film or something like that, to make larger circles, I think, maybe, hopefully. A potato. It's ages since I've done any potato printing, so I've cut a little square from a potato. Some erasers. Well, first of all, some pencils with erasers on the end. Okay, there we are. Some of them have been used, so they make different shaped spots from the one that's more square across the end. Pencils with erasers on the end. Some other erasers which you can cut into small shapes. These are all for applying the white gouache with. Rather than using a brush, I'm using other things to apply the white gouache to the paper. Okay, so white gouache, inks to paint over the gouache, and my waterproof drawing ink, and some coloured ink which I added to the waterproof ink, and that's what made this really interesting sort of stained effect, which was a little bit unexpected. I didn't quite know that was going to happen. It's rather nice. Inks, that's just some ink out in a jam jar. Knife for cutting the erasers. Brushes, it's a good scrubby brush for scrubbing off the ink. Oh, a piece of wool. I'm trying out making lines with pieces of wool. And distilled water, which is just water out of my tumble dryer. And you can get water out of a dehumidifier as well. That's using distilled water just ensures that if it gets mixed in with any of the inks don't curdle. A piece of kitchen roll, always handy to mop up spills, and dry brushes, and a piece of paper for working on. Ready to go. Just squeeze some more paint out into my little china palette. Some more gouache paint. I do like this stuff. It's a nice thick white for painting with and for mixing colours into. And it makes this fabulous resist effect, which you can see in other videos, but you'll also see demonstrated in this one. It can be painted on with a brush, or as I'm going to do today, applied using other mark making tools. It's really nice and thick, but it's got a little bit of water mixed in with it so that it's not as thick as it comes out of the tube. Now, it's going to be quite difficult to see what goes onto the white paper, because I shall be working with white paint on white paper, but all will be revealed at the end when the ink gets washed off. So the white gouache, I'm feeding it onto the wall here, and then I'm going to apply it to the paper, and then the waterproof ink goes on when the white gouache is dry, and when the waterproof ink is dry, then it gets washed off. When the waterproof ink is dry, it gets washed and scrubbed, and the waterproof ink sticks to wherever the white gouache wasn't, and wherever the white gouache was, it takes the ink on top of it away. Okay, so just allowing it to fall where it wants to fall. And give it a little pat into place with the end of a brush, just to make sure enough has gone on the paper. It makes a nice line. I have no idea what's going to happen. I just want to make some lines first before I start making some circles. It's a really lovely feeling not to have something particular in mind at the end of this session. Just take the time to play. There's no better word for it. I'm going to try making some circular marks. I've got a mixture in here of black drawing ink, black waterproof drawing ink, and the red coloured ink, which doesn't say whether it's waterproof or not, but it seems to be working quite well when mixed with the black waterproof ink. So now that my white gouache has dried on the white paper, anyway, you can see the pattern I've made with wool, tubes, erasers, potato prints. I'm going to paint on the ink, remembering not to keep brushing it out too much because I don't want to spread the gouache out and end up with a nasty streaky effect. So maybe if I tip it up a little bit, it'll help. And also roll the brush like this, roll it like that, rather than brushing like that. If I do that rolling thing, it should should prevent the white gouache from mixing with the ink. I can see, I don't know if it's visible on the video, that this is a sort of pinkish colour. And what happened, according to the test piece, was that pinkish colour seems to soak into the gouache a little bit as well, which is quite exciting. I like that. So I'll splodge it all on, and then we'll come back when the ink is dry and give it a wash, give it a scrub, see what we're left with, and then that is what I will work into, using more paint, more ink, who knows, pencil, coloured pencil, watercolours. Just keeping my mind free to respond to whatever happens. Best way to work. Here we can see all the different effects of the various printing implements I've used. And while it's wet and still in the tray, I'm going to put some coloured inks on, let them run into the watery surface. Now I'm going to tape it to a board so that it dries flat. It's very wet, so I'm just going to dry around the edges with some paper towel so that the water doesn't dissolve the gum on the gum strip that I'm going to use to stick it to the board. Here's the sponge and water that I'm going to use to wet the gum strip, which is brown paper tape, and it's the best thing to use when you're stretching paper. There now, that's a nifty trick to use to stop the brown paper tape from springing back into a roll. You just kind of need to make a pleat down the middle and it will lie nice and flat, which makes it much easier to wet with the sponge and water. I always try and make a good overlap onto the paper of at least a centimetre so that the paper doesn't pull away from the tape. You get a more successful stretch to the paper when it dries. When it's wet, paper is slightly expanded. The fibres have soaked up the water and swell. So you stick it down to the board while it's wet, and then as it dries the fibres pull back together again and the paper slightly shrinks, which is what creates the nice flat surface that you can then work onto. And it also ensures that the work dries flat when it's finished. So as long as it stays stuck to the board, it's stretched. As soon as you remove it from the board, it's not stretched any longer. Well, I got as far as that with the gouache resist and added coloured inks. While it was still wet, I taped it to a board with gummed paper tape so it would stretch and dry nice and flat, ready to do some further work on it. I took it away with me when I went to visit my family in Kent and came home without it. So, having done a bit of quick thinking, I took a screenshot from the last bit of video and printed out the image on some watercolour paper
Started off with a black and white version, accidentally, because I didn't set the print up correctly. But that's fine, because I've got another copy to play with. And then I printed a colour copy as well. So I'll carry on with that.
I'm going to look at this book about one of my favourite artists, the Swiss artist Paul Klee. Now, his work, for me, links both to the work of children's art, and art from primitive cultures. And I'll tell you why I think his work was influenced by children. He was unusual in his time, perhaps, in that he was the main child carer and housekeeper in the marriage with Lily Stumpf, who was a piano teacher and earned their living for them as a family. And you can definitely see he uses shapes the way a child would. Although they may be primitive shapes, the execution is often very complex and quite sophisticated. His work was included in the 1937 exhibition mounted by the Nazis of so-called degenerate art. So, as well as experiencing active service in the First World War, the appalling anxiety of the rise of Nazism in the interwar years, and living through the first part of the Second World War. All these things you can see are other influences in his work, and run counter to that sort of innocence and naivety and childlike quality. I think you also see horror, anxiety, dreadfulness, two sides of a very different experience and personality are expressed in his work. He was a teacher in the Bauhaus School of Art and Architecture, and also a member of Der Blaue Reiter, a group of artists who took their name from a painting of a horse and rider. Now, looking through my book of art from ancient civilisations, here I see a fish that strongly reminds me of one of Paul Klee's paintings. Let's have a look and compare. Here it is. Yes, I think they've got a look of similarity. Now, the fish would be nice to do, but I carried on looking through the book with my artwork in mind. These geometric shapes are lovely, but I've decided on the horses. I'll stick with the horse theme. So I shall trace them off, take them to the photocopier, play around with sizes and scales, and then create a group of 3, I fancy. We'll make a pleasing composition on my piece of patterned and coloured paper.
I'm going to use an oil pastel to put on the back of the tracing and on the photocopies so that I can transfer the shapes onto the piece of paper. I'll show you how. So a white oil pastel. Turn the photocopy over and apply the pastel where the shape is on the other side. I'll just do this little bit just to test and make sure it works on the black and white photocopy. So I'm going to use a sharp, hard pencil, not that one, this one, nice sharp point, and go over my lines, and that will press the oil pastel down to the paper, I hope. As long as it's visible enough, I'll be able to use that line to go around with my white gouache. What I'm going to do is to make an outline with white gouache, fade it out into the background, and then probably paint each horse a different colour with the coloured inks. That's my plan, roughly.
Well, I really like the way my 3 Shaman horses turned out. And while I was painting, my mind started wandering towards other Blaue Reiter, another Blaue Reiter artist, Franz Marc, who painted the spirits of animals, which seems to fit in with the shamanic theme. Anyway, I'm looking forward to seeing what subject you choose to do in this layered technique.